Thanks everyone for joining us on this Friday afternoon or morning for those who are watching from America. We're gonna be talking, like Sebastian said, about these last few studies that we have been carrying out from Panacea. But before I get started, I would just like to give a very brief introduction for those of you who are not maybe so familiar with the technique. So craniofacial superimposition is an identification technique, and its main goal is to establish the identity of found unknown remains. In particular, it uses the skull to compare it to the antemortem photographs of one or more possible known candidates. For example, it could be compared to missing persons database. And this helps us to either exclude from a list of candidates or to alternatively identify positively the person that these remains belong to. And the key concept of this technique is that it will be, well, we will compare the anatomy and morphology of a skull with the facial features of a person that's depicted in a photograph. And as it was the only materials that are required to apply the technique are facial photograph, which is very easy to find nowadays thanks to the widespread use of mobile phones and cameras, and then a 3D model of a skull, which can be acquired with a 3D scanner or a photogrammetry system, for example, which makes this technique really have a great potential for application in multiple scenarios. And that's like the greatest advantage that it poses, because it means that in order to attempt comparisons, we do not need to find a family member to extract a DNA sample from for genetic comparison, and we don't have to have access to dental records or fingerprints databases. So as I was saying, it greatly increases the potential of applicability. And the base of the technique is, in the first place, the uniqueness of the skull, meaning that no two people will have the same morphological characteristics in their skulls. And in the second place, the direct relationship of the anatomy and the morphology of the skull with that of the face. So in the image here, you can see an example of a skull and how it only fits with its true owner, which in this case is the woman in the right photograph here. You can really see it if you take a look at the teeth, because in this it's the most obvious part, right? Because of how well the interdental spaces match on this one, and well, on this and the center one, we can see that they fall really way below the lip line even. So that would be something that we would check, and that would point towards the exclusion of this candidate from the investigation. And that's, well, this is just a general idea of how we evaluate and how we take into consideration any kind of inconsistency like this one. The background of the technique is very extensive. This is a technique that has its first applications more than a century ago. And here in this slide, you can see that I've listed some of the examples, relevant cases in which it was used for like famous or for the identification of famous cases like Ivan the Terrible or Mengele or Mozart. And I would just like to highlight that in 1962 was the first identification that was admitted, in which CFS was the only technique used for identification, and it was admitted in court, accepted in court. And since that time, and for well over 50 years, it has been extensively applied to many different scenarios, highlighting disaster victim identification and terrorist identification. Here we have a little summary of the main stages of the application of the technique. So in the first stage, this is the acquisition and processing of antemortem and postmortem materials. There are a few tasks involved in this stage, so we will need to obtain antemortem photographs for comparison, as well as postmortem materials, which will be our 3D skull models. And well, it's a good practice to to obtain the cranium and the mandible's modules separately, so that we can then articulate them and replicate the occlusion that the person had in life. And then we can also, in skeleton ID, this means that we could compare with different apertures of the mouth. And well, apart from articulating the mandible, another part of the pre-processing would be placing some anthropometric landmarks in our antemortem and postmortem materials for comparison. Then there would be a second stage in which we could be doing a morphological and morphometric analysis of the faces and the skulls that we are going to compare. But we have found a tool or developed a tool, a ranking tool, that allows us to practically skip this step as the ranking is done by an algorithm. So next we could jump to the third stage, which would be the skull face overlay. And well, this stage has been also completely automated by algorithms in skeleton ID, and we have a processed SFO, which we will mention later also. But it's an algorithm that performs focal length and camera pose estimation from different 3D to 2D point correspondences, which are the anthropometric landmarks that I was mentioning that we place in both the photographs and the skull 3D models. And finally, the last stage would be the decision-making stage, in which the expert, using the tools that are available in skeleton ID to compare, which we will see in a minute, would start evaluating the correspondence and the inconsistencies of each of the anatomical features and the morphological characteristics of every skull face overlay. And then, according to the quantity and the quality of the materials that are being compared, would reach a decision on the identification of the remains with a given or a particular degree of support. So the main topic here, and why we have put together these two validation studies and one study that is focusing on the limits of craniofacial superimposition, is because previous studies, well, there has been some controversy regarding this technique, and previous studies were very limited. And this meant that despite this controversy, so with some authors classifying the technique as useful and powerful for positive identification, while others were claiming that it was only good for exclusion of individuals or could only be used as a source of corroborative evidence, this made authors like Carl Stephan claim that at the moment it's not present to firmly state what the reliability of CFS methods is, because of these limitations of previous studies, which is the same idea that we share at Panacea. But what we have been observing with these studies is that there is a really big room for improvement with the introduction of AI-based methods, and these could soon lead to craniofacial superimposition becoming a reliable identification method, maybe even a primary identifier. And well, these studies that I will list some of the main studies about reliability in the next couple of slides. You can take a screenshot. I will not go into detail, but the main problems or limitations that have existed in these studies were that they were either using a very small sample, which meant that the results were not really statistically sound, or that they were sometimes only using positive cases, in other cases only using negative cases, which is unrealistic conditions, because in a forensic scenario we will be comparing positives and negatives, and we will have a mix in our sample, generally with more negatives than positives, right? But just if anyone wanted to take a quick screenshot, these are some other studies about reliability coming more from our group, and I would highlight the validation study here, the second one listed here, because this was a validation study that was carried out to validate the methodological framework developed in the MEPROCS project in 2016. And yeah, now I will just list the new validation studies that we are going to be presenting here today. in the order in which you are looking at them. So firstly, we will be talking about the validation study carried out on the sample of the Vilnius January uprising, which is a historical memory sample. And this study was published last year in the International Journal of Legal Medicine. You can see here, this is a screenshot of the publication. Secondly, we will be seeing the results of our most recent validation study that was carried out in a contemporary population sample, from which we actually presented preliminary results this February at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting in Florida, listed here. And finally, at the end, we are going to very quickly see this very recent study by Oscar Ibáñez, Enrique Bermejo, and Andrea Balsecchi, in which they tried to find the theoretical limits of craniofacial superimposition. So we're going to start, as I was saying, by this first study, which was carried out by 5 different researchers: Dr. Perok from the University of Trieste, medical doctor, Mr. Neuwirth from the University of Tübingen, biologist, and then Dr. Navarro, Dr. Martos, and myself from the University of Granada, all 3 of us anthropologists. Both of them doctors, me just a postgraduate student at the time I was doing this study. We also collaborated with partners from Panacea Cooperative Research, and here is listed Andrea Balsecchi as the developer of the algorithm, the skull face overlay algorithm that we used. And we collaborated with Rimantas Jankauskas from the University of Vilnius, and who gave us the materials for the study. And him and his team recovered the remains on which the study was conducted. So to continue in relation with the human remains, these were the skulls of 19 executed leaders of an anti-Russian revolution known as the January Uprising. And this uprising took place in the 19th century between 1863 and 1864. And the remains were discovered in clandestine pits, inhumation pits, in some archaeological excavations in 2017. And then they tried to identify them for subsequent state reburials, as these people were considered heroes of their nations. The identifications were carried out using a variety of methods, which included cross-comparison of all antemortem and postmortem data, and genetic identification in those cases in which it was allowed, whenever they could find either an alive or a deceased relative, to compare these two. Of course, it was difficult because over 100 years had passed. So, but additionally, and due to the fact that some photographs of the subjects had been retrieved from historical archives, craniofacial superimposition was performed using automatic algorithms in order to validate the technology that we were developing and to compare the final decisions to those of the genetic analysis and other more traditional methods, under blind conditions, of course. So the results of the first study were presented at the 2019 International Association of Craniofacial Identification conference, but the study was later extended, and a higher number of participants provides more significant and statistically sound results, of course. To tackle this scenario, the anthropologists and researchers used skeleton ID software, which includes a series of tools and algorithms to aid the forensic expert in the identification process. And the main objectives of the study was to determine intra- and inter-observer error in both craniometric and cephalometric landmarks, and to carry out the identifications using the craniofacial superimposition technique. The materials that were used in the study were the 18 3D scanned skull models that had been acquired using a 3D structured light scanner, GoScan 20, and the 14 photographs of the 11 candidates that were from which we had access to the photographs, that were digitized using an Epson Perfection V700 scanner. Then they were all uploaded to Skeleton ID database, which allows the storage and management of thousands of antemortem photographs and skull models, and later processed in the virtual lab. The table that you see here contains information about the resolution and the quality for skull face overlay or for craniofacial superimposition of the photographs that were used in this study. I would highlight that, as you can see here, there was only one subject for which we had more than one photograph. For all the rest, we only had one photograph, mostly frontal photographs as well, which are not the most informative. And also that the quality of some of these photographs, and particularly difficult in those cases in which there's only one photograph for the identification, sometimes they were also very low quality. Of course, these were photographs from the 19th century. So you can see some examples also here of the quality of the photographs, and here an example of the scanned skull 3D model. And well, the process followed those 4 stages that I already listed before: acquisition of antemortem and postmortem materials, landmark location, then the skull face overlay, and after that, the evaluation of anatomical correspondences and decision making. So for the second stage of processing of the antemortem and postmortem materials, we located 17 pairs of facial and cranial landmarks on the skull and on the photographs, following the nomenclature and the definitions of Capel and Stefan 2015 standardized nomenclature. And we also followed the best practices of the MEPROCS consortium. For the process of placing the landmarks, the software offers a wide range of tools such as 2D and 3D auxiliary lines. It also allows us to position the skull in Frankfurt horizontal plane, and we can then access a view in 4 cameras, which allows us to see the skull in both norma frontalis and norma occipitalis in the first screen, to the 2 norma lateralis in the second screen, and to vary between norma verticalis and norma basalis in the third screen, as well as having a free camera view on the last one, which also we can also vary the reference points and mark them and adjust them. Then we also made use of the study of these facial soft tissue depth measurements that we got from Stefan's 2016 TALID, the meta study that he in which he has data from multiple populations for adult population. And we obtained 252 skull face overlays from the comparison of the 18 models against 14 photographs, which correspond to 198 CFS problems. That is the 18 skulls versus the 11 subjects that were to be identified. And this task was carried out by the post-test skull face overlay algorithm developed by Dr. Andrea Valsecchi, which performs the skull face overlay in less than 18 milliseconds. You can see here this would be the next stage, and in which after we position after the skull face overlays were obtained automatically by the landmark pairs that each researcher had placed independently, they would get some variation in the skull face overlays that were obtained according to the dispersion in the placement of the landmarks that they had placed. So we could also then refine the skull face overlay that was obtained automatically to using the tools that you are now seeing in this video. We have tools for rotation, translation, and changing the projection to adjust the camera subject distance, the focal length, and main point of the photograph, which would alter the appearance of the 3D model over the photograph. And then we can see some of the tools that were used to analyze the correspondences. On the top, the opacity variation tool, and on the bottom, the wipe tool, so that we could assess these correspondences, as I was saying. And in order to analyze the anatomical consistency between the skulls and photographs, we followed also MEPROCS guidelines. So we evaluate these 4 families of criteria. So bony facial curves and contours, and how they match both in the face and the skull. The anatomical consistency by positional relationship of the structures. This is, for example, that the eyeball is placed in the center of the eye orbit, We also evaluated asymmetries in both the photographs and the skulls, and we, using this tool that you're now seeing, these 3D colored cones, we can also assess the consistency of the soft tissue depth according to the facial soft tissue depth study that we are using, right? So yellow is in the mean plus minus 3 times the standard deviation, and green means that it's in the mean for that population. Turning to the results and taking, the participants taking into account the materials, they examined the consistency of the correspondences between the faces and the skulls, and then they gave their decision, their final decision of the identification in terms of strong, moderate, or limited support for to the assertion that the skull and the facial image belong to the same person. The table here on the left is the MEPROCS gradual scale for decision making, and it summarizes the degree of support that could be achieved. So if we have either one photo that's low quality or an incomplete skull, we will have limited support to a decision that we reach. But as the quality and quantity of materials increases, and we may have more anatomical information to make an evaluation, we will bring the support higher in the scale, right? Some of the limitations that did influence the identification process in this particular case have been that we did not have access to the original skull and the antemortem and postmortem biological profiles. The teeth were not visible in any of the photographs, and several photographs were also of poor quality for craniofacial superimposition, and as I said before, only one photograph was available for 10 of the 11 individuals. So this may explain also the occurrence of some of the false positives that we saw. But what we were able to see through this study is that the error in the dispersion in the placement of the landmarks, both in the skulls and in the photographs, was actually not high, not very significant between the anthropologists between all the participants of the study. So this means that the differences in the skull face overlays that they were obtaining did not vary that greatly, but the results of the identification definitely did. With the 3 participants that were anthropologists, the number 3, 4, and 5 reaching very high rates of accuracy in general, while the 2 participants that came from different backgrounds of biology and medicine had both 0 or only 1 correct identification. So this really shows the need for multidisciplinary training in anatomy and facial morphology, and also to have some concepts of photography and photogrammetry. But we also see that we need specific training in landmark location, in skull face overlay, and the analysis of morphological correspondences. So here I'm detailing the results of the 3 anthropologists who participated in the study. We see the accuracy of the decisions that was made that was significantly high when compared to the results obtained by the genetic analysis. And these percentages were calculated on the binary decisions made by each of the anthropologists regarding the positive or negative correspondence of each skull with each photograph. Considering that there were only 11 true positives in the sample, the rest being true negatives, these results show a very high precision, with an average of like 98.8 correct decisions among the 3 researchers, which is, in my opinion, extremely promising and really illustrates the huge potential of applying artificial intelligence-guided software to human identification. And I believe further developments towards automating the different steps of the process and validating the techniques are on our way, as you will see with the next study. I will just very briefly share some of the examples of the photographs that we used in this first one and the tools used to analyze the correspondences. Here you see with the opacity variation, the wipe, and the cones that I was talking about. And here is an example of a negative case as well. So I would just like to add that some other things that are interesting, I think, regarding this study. So this was initially, just to say that this was initially approached as a closed scenario by the 2 anthropologists that did this in the first place, Dr. Martos and Dr. Navarro. And then it was found later that the remains of one of the individuals were not actually in any of the inhumation pits, that one of the photographs was actually belonged to the brother of one of the candidates or one of the victims. And some 3D models were not among in the sample. So these are also some of the things that limited the results of the study and that minimized the chances of identification. And I think we're just going to, we're going to move on to the second study. So after seeing the results of the study and the limitations that we had come to find in our first study, which were mainly related to the fact that some of the people were not coming from an anthropology background, and also to the quality and quantity of materials, we then decided to design another study in which we would only involve anthropologists with varied degrees of experience in craniofacial superimposition, but at least all coming from the same academic background. And we also decided to look for a contemporary population sample so that we would be able to have better quality photographs at least. The quantity of photographs was also not that great, but you can see here we had 47 photographs for 25 antemortem cases. So no, in this case, we did not have, for some subjects, we only had one photograph again, like in the previous study, but at least they were mostly better quality than 19th century ones. And then we had 25 postmortem skulls, and here is the list of the participants that took place in the study, and their academic background. So you see half of them were PhDs, well, 4 of them were PhDs in doctors in forensic anthropology, 1 student, 1 MA in forensic anthropology, and the rest postgraduate students in forensic anthropology. 2 of the participants were experts. 1 of them had some experience, and then all the rest had no previous experience, and this was the first time that they were introduced to craniofacial superimposition. We did do a small training and gave them some of the basic fundamental concepts so that they would be able to tackle the scenario. And well, regarding both the quality and the quantity of the materials for craniofacial superimposition within the 25, well, I would like to say first of all, sorry, that these materials were shared with us by Dr. Kimberly and Jennifer Gold at the University of South Florida, and they all come from the human donation program that they have at the forensic anthropology lab there. And regarding their quality and the quantity, so within the 25 antemortem cases, 13 of them only had 1 photograph, and then for 7 of them we have 2 photographs, and the 5 remaining had either 3 or more photographs. From these photographs, 85% of them did have some hidden landmarks, and most of them also presented obscuring objects such as facial hair, mustache, beards, glasses, and sometimes in some of them, the good thing was that the teeth were visible in approximately half of them, which did ease the comparison with those skulls that did also have teeth, of course. And out of the 25 3D skulls, 15 of them were separately scanned from their respective mandibles and later articulated to allow for the replication of the position, as I was saying, in the antemortem photograph for comparison, while 10 had been scanned, articulated, and then could not be rescanned for the purpose of the study and to comply with MEPROCS guidelines. So this also was another limitation, and then dental comparison was only possible in the case of some skulls, 19 of them, because 6 were edentulous by the time we got them, and against cases where we, of course, have photographs of the subject smiling, which were, like I said, only half of them. And here is the set of landmarks that we placed for the study. In this case, the landmarks were automatically located on the skull 3D models using Dr. Bermejo's automatic craniometric landmark annotation algorithm. And the facial photographs were annotated using Dr. Gomez cephalometric landmark location and algorithm. So each participant received the automatically located landmarks in a CSV file for each skull and for each photograph, and then they carried out their own refinement in order to then perform the skull face overlay stage. Then we did the skull face overlays with the processed skull face overlay algorithm, and a manual refinement was carried out in those cases in which it was necessary. And we used the ranking algorithm in this study, which generates a list of potential matches that are based on the results of the skull face overlay that is produced by the processed skull face overlay algorithm. So this ranking algorithm uses both the values of the soft tissue depth study and the positions of the craniometric and the cephalometric landmarks to generate the skull face overlays. And although the location of facial and cranial landmarks was automated, it still requires supervision and might require refinements, like I was saying. And well, we use this automatic ranking algorithm that would always place the positive case within the first 3 candidates, and this information was made available to the participants. And thus, this meant, that in a large cross-comparison scenario, such as this one, where we have 25 antemortem versus 25 postmortem cases, and this ascends to 625 craniofacial superimposition problems, the expert would only have to review those 25 antemortem versus 3 postmortem, which means 75 cases, and this drastically reduces the required effort and time inversion rate for the application of craniofacial superimposition. The reduction of time that we find if we compare this study with the previous one is really considerable by 3 times. Roughly, it took the same time to perform this study and the previous one, even though this one has 3 times more the materials, pretty much. We also use the same tools that had been previously used in the previous study. Again, I think I should highlight that what we notice is that the time investment in this scenario was really much less, taking into consideration that in this case we're reaching over 1,000 comparisons, while in the previous one we had 252. We use the same MEPROCS gradual scale for decision making in order to consider what materials had been examined and the consistency of the match between the faces and the skulls, to provide the terms in terms of a strong, moderate, or limited support. But as you saw, most of the participants had no experience before this study, and they did classify the cases very differently. This is probably due to that they might have given more weight to their own evaluation that they did than to the quality and the quantity of materials, like the scale suggests, which turns to be more of a degree of support, so that they are using this degree of support more like a quantifier of the correspondence that they observe than a way to actually describe the quantity and quality of materials. However, I put them all here, and what we have been observing is that errors do happen in those cases that the participant is actually classifying as a more limited or a moderate support. We also encountered some limitations in this study, like in the previous one, we did not have access to the original skulls or to the antemortem and postmortem biological profile. The teeth were not visible in all photographs and not all cases of all subjects, like I said. Several photographs were of poor quality. For some subjects, we only did have like one photograph of the passport. And this is less than ideal for craniofacial superimposition. But what we get more, this is just preliminary results. I did not put on in the detailed results, but what we can see is that the degree of experience, like we saw in our previous study, is highly related to how accurate the decisions of the participant are. And with experts and people that had some experience, we found that they had a 100% of correct decisions, so they made no mistakes. They identified the 25 antemortem and the 25 postmortem correctly, all of them. But with those that had no experience, this percentage was actually lower. And we see that the errors are mostly happening in those cases with limited support. This table here is representing the distribution of errors, and not meaning that in limited cases 50% of those limited cases are errors. It just means that all the errors that happen, 57% of them are occurring in cases with limited support. And we believe that the results obtained really suggest that craniofacial superimposition is a very reliable technique in those cases where there is a good amount of material and when it's applied by a trained expert. And well, we're going to move to the last study. This is not per se a validation study, but more some experiments that have been run in collaboration between Panacea and the universities of Granada and A Coruña, and that are trying to find the theoretical limits of this technique. And so there's actually two sub-studies within this study, but they are both geared towards the same objective. And the idea is just to seeking to test the hypothesis that I said just in the beginning of the talk, that the skull and the face are unique and strongly related. This is, like I said, a widely accepted hypothesis in anthropology, especially by those specialists that have a strong focus on craniofacial identification, but without actually empirical evidence. So we sought to test it empirically. And these two sub-studies that were carried out, they both simplify the problem by using a landmark-based approach. So as you may know, there are two types of approaches in craniofacial superimposition, one where we are based in landmarks and one where we are more based in morphological criteria. The recommendation by MEPROCS consortium was to use a combination of both. But by simplifying the problem, we can control the variables better and thus observe where the errors are introduced in the process. So in this first sub-study, what we did is we had 321 CT scans coming from the thesis of Dr. Guyomark, and we obtained the 321 3D models from these, and generated photographs from each facial model, which means over 3,000 photographs. Then we placed 29 landmarks on, which are plotted here, landmark pairs, and we use the POSEST skull face overlay algorithm to then carry out the overlays, and then check how the ranking tool is ranking them. We vary in order to create more realistic conditions. What we did, we used the direction and the thickness of soft tissue that was known, but then we introduced error by in the landmarks. So by creating a dispersion of 5 by 5 pixels in each of the landmarks, we can replicate the error or the dispersion that an anthropologist or a researcher or a forensic expert would have in the imprecision that they have when they are placing the landmarks manually, right? And this equals, well, I didn't mention before, but the comparison of the 321 3D models with the photographs equals to over 1 million comparisons. And here's the results that were obtained in the first experiment. This is the results of two different experiments. In the first experiment, you can see that we have the real data of the facial soft tissue thickness, and we actually know also the soft tissue direction. There is no noise in the placement of landmarks. And in this study, we get a perfect positive identification with a 100% accuracy and with an average ranking of 1. This means that the correct candidate is always positioned in the first place by the ranking tool. And then we vary the conditions of the study from more ideal, like this one, to more realistic. And in this second study, on the first part, we are introducing the facial soft tissue thickness mean. So we are using the mean, not the facial soft tissue thickness of the particular case, and we are varying with playing with the noise. So with no imprecision in landmarks or with imprecision in landmarks, we can see that the ranking is decreasing. So it is at a higher position, and we are also decreasing the accuracy. And then in the last example, what we have is we are also not knowing the soft tissue direction between the cranial and the facial landmarks, and we play with both no noise in the landmarks and with 5-pixel noise, and we get to an even worse ranking with in getting to number 8, where we would have the positive score. And what stands out here is that when we have enough information, so in these perfect conditions with 29 landmarks and perfect information, in over 1 million comparisons, the technique is never wrong. It's always 100%, which shows great potential of the technique that could possibly be considered as a primary identifier in the near future. And then we have the sub-study 2, which is very similar, only if in a smaller sample as well. In here, we are comparing we are obtaining cranial and facial landmarks from 70 subjects coming from the CT scans, again, of the thesis of Dr. Guillaumarc, and generating, again, 10 photographs for each facial model. We have a total of 700 photographs, sorry. And we compare those with 3D skulls and get over almost 50,000 comparisons. Here, what we are varying is the number of landmarks that we are using. So here is the perfect example, like we said, but using only up to 16 landmarks. So we never get to 100% of accuracy if we don't use a greater number of landmarks. But we can see here that as soon as we are introducing more in uncertainty, either in the soft tissue depth or in the soft tissue direction, or we introduce even more error in the placement of landmarks, then we get to a lower accuracy. And we can see also how this accuracy is related with the number of landmarks that we are using. Same for this graph here. We get to ranking a mean ranking of 2 with using the 16 landmarks in the best case. And as long as, well, basically the more points or more landmarks that we are considering, the more precise the algorithm is. And this means that, well, we could do an analogy with dactyloscopy, in which they are also taking a look at these correspondences and at these points of reference that they are checking. And here in craniofacial superimposition, the expert would have to study the complete anatomy, right? We are not just looking at landmarks and how close these landmarks are, but then we would do a complete analysis of the facial and cranial morphology and correspondences. So this means that with this ranking tool, we could only basing it on landmarks, we could filter an entire database, and then we could maybe start the anatomical comparison or morphological comparison, including the teeth, which by themselves can identify a person, right? And this again just shows the great potential of the technique, in our opinion. So I think I'm pretty much done. I would like to thank all of the participants in these 2 studies, some of them that I see here. Hi, Terry. And all the university that have collaborated with us, both in providing the materials and in the preparation of the studies. I think we still have a few minutes left, so I will be very happy to hear any questions or comments that you may have. And again, thank you very much for your attention.